and one for those who have no community in which to share the joys or sorrows. Now it's time for our responsive reading. Number 440 in the back of your hymnal. From the fragmented world. From the fragmented world of our everyday lives, we gather together in search of wholeness.
By many cares and preoccupations, by diverse and selfish aims, are we separated from one another and divided within ourselves.
Yet we know that no branch is utterly severed from the tree of life that sustains us all.
We cherish our oneness with those around us and count those generations that have gone before us.
We would hold fast to all of good we inherit, even as we would leave behind us the outworn and the false.
We would escape from bondage to the ideas of our own day and from the delusions of our own fancy.
Let us labor in hope for the dawning of a new day without hatred, violence, and injustice.
Let us nurture the growth of our own lives of the love that has shone in the lives and grace of men and women, the rays of whose lamps still illuminate our way.
In this spirit we gather, in this spirit we pray. Every week in our church we take up an offering. It is a symbol of all the ways in which we support each other and this community. We thank you for these gifts and all your gifts of time and service. Thank you, Joe. I invite you now to stand as you are willing and able and join in the singing of hymn number 398, To See the World, 398. To see the world as it brings us This morning, we're going to have a guest speaker via the video. His name is Chris Hedges, and he was a correspondent for the New York Times. His direct experience in the immense suffering in war zones around the world gives his voice a very dramatic and deeply moving personal authority. We are about to hear a 25-minute sermon given during the Action for Justice Sunday service at Community Church of New York on May 13th, 2012. The sermon is, "Were You There When They Crucified My Lord?" And Chris Hedges wrote this sermon himself. He is also a Unitarian minister.
The Occupy movement, along with the uprisings around the globe, is the last force left that has the capacity to halt the corporate destruction of the ecosystem and the reconfiguration of this nation, as well as the global economy, into a frightening neo-feudalism, a world of masters and serfs. It will as well be the force that will revitalize traditional Christianity or signal its moral, social, and political irrelevance. The mainstream church, battered by declining numbers and a failure to defiantly condemn the crimes and cruelty of the corporate state, as well as vigorously attack the charlatans of the Christian right whose misuse of the gospel to champion unfettered capitalism, bigotry, homophobia, and imperialism is heretical, has become for many a marginal force, especially the young. Outside the doors of our churches is a movement driven largely by young men and women, which has as its unofficial credo the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall possess the earth. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for justice, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons and daughters of God. And blessed are they who suffer persecution for justice' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. It was the church in Latin America, especially in Central America and Augusto Pinochet's Chile, which provided the physical space, moral support, and direction for opposition to dictatorship. It was the church in East Germany that organized the peaceful opposition marches in Leipzig that would bring down the communist regime. It was the church in Czechoslovakia and its 90-year-old cardinal that blessed and defended the Velvet Revolution. It was the church in Poland that provided the physical space and moral grounding for solidarity. The church, especially the African American church, made possible the civil rights movement And it is the church which can make manifest its commitment to the gospel and nonviolent social change by turning out today in the street. If these nonviolent movements fail, they will eventually be replaced by ones that employ violence. And if they fail, they will fail in part because good men and women, especially those in the church, did nothing. Where is the institutional church now? Where are most of the clergy? Why do so many church doors remain shut? Why do so many churches refuse to carry out the central mandate of the Christian gospel and lift up the cross? Someday they are going to have to answer the question, where were you when they crucified my Lord? I was arrested in November when other Occupy protesters and I sat down in front of the entrance of Goldman Sachs and refused to leave. We had spent the morning with Cornel West in Zuccotti Park, holding a people's hearing of Goldman Sachs, which gave those who had lost jobs, including New York City public school teachers, and those who had lost homes to foreclosures, a voice. As I sat on that sidewalk and closed my eyes, I saw faces. They were not the faces of the smug Goldman Sachs employees who peered at us through the revolving glass doors and lobby windows, a collection of middle-aged fraternity and sorority members. They were not the faces of the blue uniformed police, with their dangling cords of white and black plastic handcuffs, or the thuggish Goldman Sachs security personnel whose buzz cuts and dead eyes reminded me of the East German secret police, the Stasi. They were not the faces of the demonstrators around me, the ones with massive student debt and no jobs, the ones whose broken dreams weighed down on them like a cross, the ones whose anger and betrayal triggered these street demonstrations and occupations for justice. They were not the faces of the onlookers, the construction workers who seemed cheered by the march on Goldman Sachs, or the suited businessmen who did not. They were faraway faces. They were the faces of children dying. They were tiny, confused, bewildered faces I had seen in the southern Sudan, in Gaza, in the slums of Brazzaville, Nairobi, Cairo, and New Delhi, as well as the wars I covered. They were large. They were faces with large, glassy eyes above bloated bellies. They were the small faces of children, convulsed by the ravages of starvation and disease. They were faces that asked us in their helplessness, where were you when they crucified my Lord? I carry these faces. They do not leave me. I look at my own children and cannot forget them. These other children who never had a chance. War brings with it a host of horrors, including famine. But the worst is always the human detritus that war leaves behind, the small, frail bodies whose tangled limbs and vacant eyes condemn us all. The wealthy and the powerful, the ones behind the glass at Goldman Sachs, laughed and snapped pictures of us as if we were a brief and odd lunchtime diversion from commodities trading, from hoarding and profit, from this collective sickness of money worship, as if we were creatures in a cage, which in fact we soon were. A glass tower filled with people, carefully selected for their polish and self-assurance, that come with having been formed in institutions of privilege, whose primary attributes are a lack of consciousness, a penchant for deception, and an incapacity for empathy or remorse. The curious onlookers behind the windows, and we, arms locked in a circle on the concrete outside, did not speak the same language. Profit, globalization, war, national security. These are the words they use to justify the snuffing out of tiny lives, acts of radical evil. Goldman Sachs's commodity index is the most heavily traded in the world. Those who trade it have, by buying up and hoarding commodities futures, doubled and tripled the cost of wheat, rice, and corn. Hundreds of millions of poor across the globe are going hungry to feed this mania for profit. The technical jargon learned in business schools and on trading floors effectively masks the reality of what is happening. The murder of innocence. The words of commerce are designed to make systems operate, even systems of death, with a cold neutrality. Peace, love, justice, the sanctity of life, reverence, self-sacrifice, in temples of greed like Goldman Sachs are, as W.H. Auden understood, soiled, profaned, debased to a horrid mechanical screech. We have lost, at least until the advent of the Occupy movement, not only all personal responsibility, but all capacity for personal judgment. Corporate culture absolves all of responsibility, and this is part of its appeal. It relieves all from moral choice. There is an unequivocal acceptance of ruling principles such as unregulated capitalism and globalization as a kind of natural law. The steady march of corporate capitalism requires a passive acceptance of new laws and demolished regulations, of bailouts in the trillions of dollars and the systematic looting of public funds, of lies and deceit. And the corporate culture, epitomized by Goldman Sachs, has seeped into our classrooms, our newsrooms, our entertainment systems, our consciousness, and yes, our churches. This corporate culture has stripped us of the right to express ourselves outside of the narrowly accepted confines of the established political order. It has turned us into compliant consumers. We are forced to surrender our voice. These corporate machines, like fraternities and sororities in elite colleges, also haze new recruits in company rituals, force them to adopt an unrelenting cheerfulness, a childish optimism, and an obsequiousness to authority. These corporate rituals, bolstered by retreats and training seminars, by grueling days that sometimes end with initiates, curled up under their desks to sleep at night, ensure that only the most morally supine remain. The strong and independent are weeded out. Only the unquestioning advance upward. Corporate culture serves a faceless system. It is, as Hannah Arendt writes, the rule of nobody, and for this very reason, perhaps the least human and most cruel form of rulership. Our political class and its courtiers on the airwaves insist that if we refuse to comply, if we step outside the Democratic Party, if we rebel, we will make things worse. The game of accepting lesser evil enables us to forget that what we accept is still evil. It enables us to rationalize the steady erosion of justice and corporate plundering. It enables corporations to harvest and defraud the nation, and finally the global economy. This game goes on until there is hardly any action carried out by the power elite that is not a crime. It goes on until corporate predators who long ago decided that the nation and the planet were not worth salvaging seize the last drops of wealth. It goes on until moral acts, such as calling for those inside the corporate headquarters of these companies to be tried, see you jailed. And the crimes of financial fraud and perjury are upheld as lawful and rewarded by the courts, the U.S. Treasury, and the Congress. And all this is done so a handful of rapacious, immoral plutocrats such as Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, who earns about $250,000 a day, and who lied to the U.S. Congress as well as his investors and the public, can use their dirty money to retreat into their own forbidden cities or Versailles, while their underlings, basking in the arrogance of power, snap amusing photos of the rabble outside their gates being hauled away by the police. Where were you when they crucified my Lord? It is always the respectable classes, the polished Ivy League graduates, the prep school boys and girls who grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, or Short Hills, New Jersey, who are the most susceptible to evil. To be intelligent, as many of them are, at least in a narrow, analytical way, is morally neutral. These respectable citizens are inculcated in their elitist enclaves with values and norms, including pious acts of charity or philanthropy, used to justify their privilege and a belief in the innate goodness of American power. They are trained to pay deference to systems of authority. They are taught to believe in their own goodness, unable to see or comprehend, and are perhaps indifferent to the cruelty inflicted on others by the exclusive systems they serve. And as norms mutate and change, as the world is steadily transformed by corporate forces into one of a small cobble of predators and a vast herd of human prey, these elites seamlessly replace one set of values with another. For these elites obey the rules. They make the system work, and they are rewarded for this. In return, they do not question. Those who do resist, the doubters, the outcasts, the renegades, the skeptics, the rebels, rarely come from the elite. They ask different questions. They seek something else, a life of meaning. They have grasped Immanuel Kant's dictum: if justice perishes, human life on earth has lost its meaning. And in their search they come to the conclusion that, as Socrates said, it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. This conclusion is rational. It cannot be rationally defended. It makes a leap into the moral, which is beyond rational thought. It refuses to place a monetary value on human life. It acknowledges that human life, indeed all life, is sacred. And this is why, as Hannah Arendt points out, the only morally reliable people, when the chips are down, are not those who say this is wrong or this should not be done, but those who say, I can't. The greatest evildoers are those who don't remember because they have never given thought to the matter, and without remembrance, nothing can hold them back, Arendt wrote. For human beings, thinking of past matters means moving in the dimension of depth, striking roots, and thus stabilizing ourselves so as not to be swept away by whatever may occur, the zeitgeist or history or simple temptation. The greatest evil is not radical. It has no roots. And because it has no roots, it has no limitations. It can go to unthinkable extremes and sweep over the whole world. There are streaks in my lungs, traces of the tuberculosis that I picked up around hundreds of dying Sudanese during the 1989 famine I covered as a foreign correspondent. 250,000 people, the majority children, died. I was strong and privileged and fought off the disease. They did not. The bodies of these children were dumped into hastily dug mass graves. The scars I carry within me are the whispers of these dead, tattoos left on my body by the crucified of the earth. They are the faint marks of those who never had a chance to become men or women, to fall in love and have children of their own. I carried these scars to the doors of Goldman Sachs. I had returned to the living. I placed myself at the feet of these commodity traders to call for justice, because the dead and those who are dying in slums and refugee camps across the planet could not make this journey. I see their faces. They haunt me in the day and come to me in the dark. They force me to remember. They make me choose sides. Where were you when they crucified my Lord? I place my body in the streets because I know that it is not what we say or profess, but what we do. I have seen in my many years overseas as a foreign correspondent that great men and women of moral probity and courage arise in all cultures and all religions to fight the oppressor on behalf of the oppressed. I have seen that it is possible to be a Jew, a Buddhist, a Muslim, a Christian, a Hindu, or an atheist, and carry the cross. The words are different, but the self-sacrifice and thirst for justice are the same. And these men and women who may not profess what I profess or believe what I believe are my brothers and sisters, and I stand with them, honoring and respecting our differences and finding hope and strength and love in our common commitment. They are my congregation, and where they are is my church. At times like these, I hear the voices of the saints who went before us, the suffragist Susan B. Anthony, who announced that resistance to tyranny is obedience to God, and the suffragist Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who said the moment we begin to fear the opinions of others and hesitate to tell the truth that is in us, and for motives of policy are silent when we should speak, the divine floods of light and life no longer flow into our souls. Or Henry David Thoreau, who told us that we should be men and women first and subjects afterward, that we should cultivate a respect not for the law, but for what is right. And Frederick Douglass, who warned us power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. Find out just what any person will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows or both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. And the great 19th century populist Mary Elizabeth Lease, who thundered, "Wall Street owns the country. It is no longer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but a government of Wall Street, by Wall Street, and for Wall Street. The great common people of this country are slaves, and monopoly is the master." And General Smedley Butler, who said that after 33 years and 4 months in the Marine Corps, he had come to understand that he had been nothing more than a gangster for capitalism, making Mexico safe for American oil interests, making Haiti and Cuba safe for banks, and pacifying the Dominican Republic for sugar companies. War, he said, is a racket in which newly dominated countries are exploited by the financial elites and Wall Street, while the citizens foot the bill and sacrifice their young men and women on the battlefield for corporate greed. Or Eugene V. Debs, the socialist presidential candidate who in 1912 pulled almost 1 million votes, or 6%, and who was sent to prison by Woodrow Wilson for opposing the First World War, and who told the world, "While there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free." And Rabbi Abraham Heschel, who when he was criticized for walking with Martin Luther King on the Sabbath in Selma, answered, "I pray with my feet." And who quoted Samuel Johnson, who said, "The opposite of good is not evil. The opposite of good is indifference." And Rosa Parks, who defied the segregated bus system and said, "The only tired I was tired of giving in." And Philip Berrigan, who said, "If enough Christians follow the gospel, they can bring any state to its knees." And the poet Langston Hughes, who wrote, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?" And Martin Luther King, who said, "On some positions, cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? And there comes a time when a true follower of Jesus Christ must take a stand that's neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but he or she must take a stand because it is right. Where were you when they crucified my Lord? Were you there to halt the genocide of Native Americans? Were you there when Sitting Bull died on the cross? Were you there to halt the enslavement of African Americans? Were you there to halt the mobs that terrorized black men, women, and even children with lynching during Jim Crow? Were you there when they persecuted union organizers and Joe Hill died on the cross? Were you there to halt the incarceration of Japanese Americans in World War II? Were you there to stop Bull Connor's dogs as they were unleashed on civil rights marchers in Birmingham? Were you there when Martin Luther King died upon the cross? Were you there when Malcolm X died on the cross? Were you there to halt the hate crimes, discrimination, and violence against gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and those who are transgender? Were you there when Matthew Shepard died on the cross? Were you there to halt the abuse and at times enslavement of workers in the farmlands of this country? Were you there to halt the murder of hundreds of thousands of innocent Vietnamese during the war in Vietnam, or hundreds of thousands of Muslims in Iraq and Afghanistan? Were you there to halt Israel's saturation bombing of Lebanon and Gaza? Were you there when Rachel Corrie died on the cross? Were you there to halt the corporate forces that have left men and women and poor in this country, including over 200,000 people this week who will lose their unemployment benefits, bereft of a sustainable income, hope, and dignity? Were you there to share your food with your neighbor in Zuccotti Park? Were you there to become homeless with them? Time is running out. The environmental crisis, if left in the hands of these corporate plutocrats, driven by obscene quests for profit and the dictates of the fossil fuel industry, will doom us. The security and surveillance state is steadily stripping us of our basic civil liberties, rather than address the plight of our underclass and beleaguered middle class. Our political system has evolved into a corporate charade, a spectacle, a species of political theater. It is up to us. It requires us to act. The cross of Christ lies outside these doors on the streets of New York. And we must, with an urgency that means the future not only of our planet but our species, an urgency that calls up us to stand up for life, for those children on Mother's Day who will come after us, an urgency that demands that we answer the most important question of our age. Where were you when they crucified my Lord? Thank you.
It's heartening to see that our reaction was the same as the audience at Community Church back there on May 13th last year, that of applause after he spoke. Okay, now time to do our closing hymn. Please stand as you are willing and able. Joining in the singing of our closing hymn, number 34, Though I May Speak with Bravest Fire. Please join me in the reading of our West Valley Union Church's mission statement, printed in the order of service. This church provides a safe place to celebrate diversity, for inspiration for our lives, foster social and environmental justice, and compassionately support each other in our spiritual searches. I'd like, as we close, to read a poem by Maura Levine, also a Unitarian poet. She and her husband are Unitarians. A poem called At the Piano. How close we sat, his elfin face absorbed, as he rambled the whites on the upright, then blacks, sharps and flats, small fingers reaching for flight. This 6-year-old, my hand of 60 years lightly on his, opening each note, reclaiming this language of my childhood. Here's middle C, I say, the North Star of keys, compass point for sound travel. In his face are quick translations to tempo, arpeggios, crescendo, eyes fixed on the score, prompting fingers to leapfrog or glide. Now he commandeers the seat, his fingers shaping songs across the keys, while I stand to merely turn the pages. Morgan James will now perform this morning's postlude.